Good evening. We are waiting for Vanessa Frazier to join in. We'll start shortly. Hello again, good evening, and welcome. I'm Daniel Darmanin, the President of the Justice and Peace Commission, and it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you here in this great hall in the Archbishop's Curia. We have gathered here today to mark the 60th anniversary from the publication of Pacem in Terris, an important encyclical written by Pope John XXIII at a time when the world was undergoing significant changes and facing numerous challenges. 60 years later, the world is very different, and yet similarities abound. Today again, the divide between the East and West is growing, whilst polarization between ideological camps is becoming the norm. The threat of nuclear war is on the horizon, whilst many countries are still struggling to overcome poverty, inequality, and social injustice. The message of Pacem in Terris remains crucial today. Pacem in Terris, first of all, serves as a reminder that every person deserves to be treated with respect and compassion, and that promoting human dignity is essential for achieving peace and justice. Indeed, unless there is justice, there can be no peace. This is the origin of the name of our commission. Our name is our mission, but as time goes by, the more I realize how complex the work of justice and peace is. For today's event, we wanted to delve deeper into how, as a country, we can and should continue the work and practice for the peace emphasized in Pacem in Terris. Having a seat at the UN Security Council, which, despite its many deficiencies, remains one of the best tools for achieving peace in the world, is a big responsibility for a small country like ours. Many say that Malta has always punched above its weight when it comes to peace building, and this could be also attributed to the neutrality clause in the Constitution. The question, however, remains, what sort of neutrality do we want for our country? Do we understand neutrality as a way of shirking responsibility, remaining indifferent to evil, and turning a blind eye to injustices, all for the sake of self-preservation? Or is it a tool which enables us to be able to build bridges and a means to broker peace and prevent conflicts? The former type of neutrality is a dangerous and unethical position that fails to acknowledge the suffering of others and perpetuates a cycle of violence, whilst the latter implies an active involvement with different sides to find common ground, promotes dialogue, and work towards a peaceful resolution of conflicts. As we look at the world around us, we can see examples of both types of neutrality. We see leaders who remain indifferent to the suffering of people, who turn a blind eye to injustice and who prioritize their own power over the well-being of humanity. I believe that this type of neutrality is not true neutrality. It is complicity in evil. At the same time, we also see leaders who work tirelessly to broker peace and promote dialogue, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. They recognize the importance of engaging with different sides, of listening to diverse perspectives, and of finding common ground to build a more just and peaceful world. I'm sure many of those present here today have very strong and maybe even opposing views about this subject. However, we think that it is part of our mission to create spaces of dialogue and encounter, even though we might not convince each other. As Pope Francis reminds us, dialogue is the oxygen of peace. I hope that you have a pleasant evening and that the discussion will stimulate each one of us to strive for peace on earth. Pacem in terris. Thank you. I now invite Mark Kakia, Executive Officer of the Commission, to present the guests and moderate the discussion. Thank you.
Welcome once again to everyone. Very, very brief presentation of the hopefully 5 speakers, because Vanessa is not yet online, we will have with us tonight. Father Carlo Calleia read for his doctorate in moral theology at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry and is a resident academic at the University of Malta in the areas of theological ethics and applied ethics. Professor Edward Warrington is an associate professor in the Department of Public Policy at the University of Malta and is a specialist on governance and institutional design and has a particular interest in microstates. Mr. Rainer Sadni is a member of the Department of Anthropological Sciences at the University of Malta, where he teaches political anthropology and the anthropology of the Middle East and North Africa. Professor Anna Kaki is an associate professor in the Department of International Relations at the University of Malta. She holds a PhD from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, Switzerland. And finally, Ambassador Vanessa Fraser joined the Diplomatic Corps in 1992 and throughout her career has been posted to the Maltese embassies in Washington, twice in Rome, London, Brussels, and New York, where she is currently serving as a permanent representative of Malta to the United Nations. Without further ado, our first speaker, Father Carlo Calleia.
Your Grace, Bishop Galliaturmi, distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues, good evening. Okay. Good evening. It is an honor to share with you my views on how Malta's neutrality serves the cause of peace. If you don't mind, I'll be reading my contribution. Do you think that I have come to give peace on earth? no, I tell you, but rather division. Most of you would have recognized these words from the Gospel of Luke. These poignant words, uttered by Christ, the ultimate pacemaker, might jar with what is being discussed today, neutrality and the cause for peace, for which our world craves so much at this point in history. But I believe that these words of Christ can help us frame a bit better our understanding of neutrality in the Catholic social teaching tradition. With rather thick brush strokes, I would like to make my argument based on points taken from Pacem in Terris and other church documents, and I'm going to make 3 points. First of all, that neutrality does not imply doing nothing. Rather, it urges us to do something on an international political level, and therefore neutrality as taking a proactive stance. Second, neutrality calls us to take responsibility for our actions. And third, neutrality urges us to create a culture not merely of war, just war or pacifism, but rather one of peace building. So first, neutrality implies adopting a proactive stance. On the 7th of February 2019, during a conference on the Holy See and the Vatican in the new international context held in Rome, Vatican Secretary of State Cardinal Parolin had stated that the Holy See deploys that positive neutrality which is typically its own. That is, not the neutrality of one who stands at the window and watches the course of conflicts between powers, but rather that of one who, without taking part in either one or the other, takes positive action to favor the overcoming of conflict. Moreover, at least twice in 2022, on Victory Day and later on Remembrance Day, in his homilies, Archbishop Charles J. Scicluna reminded the Maltese faithful that being neutral does not mean being complicit in the injustice that war brings, and he insisted that while maintaining a neutral approach, we must still take a stand against aggression. In the name of justice, Archbishop Scicluna said, in the name of solidarity, one cannot be neutral. One must take a stand. The words of Parolin and of Scicluna echo the words of Pope Francis, who, reflecting on the words of the Gospel that I've just read at the beginning of my contribution, he commented, Jesus does not bring neutrality. This peace is not a compromise at all costs. Following Jesus entails giving up evil and selfishness and choosing good, truth, and justice, even when this demands sacrifice and the renunciation of our own interests. And this indeed divides. As we know, it even cuts the closest ties. However, be careful, Pope Francis continues, it is not Jesus who divides. He establishes the criterion, whether to live for ourselves or to live for God and for others, to be served or to serve, to obey one's ego or to obey God. Pacem in Terris sheds light on how a proactive stance can be held while maintaining neutrality. Although neutrality is only referred to in passing in paragraph 124 by quoting Pius XII in the context of countries that opt for neutrality for economic reasons, it later makes an even stronger argument for countries to safeguard the rights of all human beings at all costs. And one particular commenter, a Jesuit, the late Drew Christensen, notes that authorities must look beyond the limits of their own immediate jurisdiction and exercise powers in defense of the universal common good, not just where their own nations are affected, but in the interest of the rights of all persons, especially those who lack protection. This is known as the global political authority that Pacem in Terris puts forward. And this is also emphasized by Pope Paul II in his 2003 World Day of Peace message, where he supported the United Nations initiative and had argued that a universal political authority does not mean writing the constitution of a global superstate, Rather, it means continuing and deepening processes already in place to meet the almost universal demand for participatory ways of exercising political authority, even international political authority, for transparency and accountability at every level of political life. The second point I'd like to make is about taking responsibility for our actions by being neutral. It implies also. Okay. So in 2014, Pope Francis had called out the world war which is being fought piecemeal. And he took up this theme again in the 2016 World Day for Peace message and again in Laudato Si, where he says that in the world, there is so much going on with war, terrorism, kidnappings, and the misuse of power, which all are leading to this third world war being fought piecemeal. Putin's rhetoric that the war in Ukraine is the result of a decadent West cannot be trusted, and we can see no parallelism between him and Popes Benedict and Pope Francis. However, they too have in some way or another criticized the loss of Christian values in the West and cultural colonialization. And therefore, in the larger scheme of things, it is true that the uprootedness of Christian values, which formerly gave shape to Europe, including a healthy secular Europe, is a reality, and that the atrophy of Christian values will only spur violence and political disagreement even further. What are these values? The values of common good, of solidarity, of human dignity, freedom, and so on. So the third point is committing ourselves to becoming peace builders. In the history of the tradition of the Church, there is, as you know, just war tradition. On the other hand, pacifism. Nowadays, both parties, both sides of the spectrum are coming together to a third form, which is peace building. And this is something that Pacem in Terris did for the first time in the history of the Church. It called out war as no longer being a suitable way to restore rights once they have been violated. There is a shift, therefore, in Pacem in Terris towards disarmament and mutual and effective controls. Church teaching, therefore, moved from unqualified adherence to just war towards advocacy of nonviolent resolution of conflict. And this is something that we all have to take a stance in favor of. We speak nowadays not simply of peace, but of just peace, spelt as one word, just peace, which engages the grassroots, international and religious actors, puts social welfare over market economics, and prioritizes restorative justice. I'd like to end with a quotation by Pope Francis. When Pope Francis reflected on his visit to Malta, he had called Malta a laboratory of peace. Malta, in its entirety, is a peace laboratory. The entire nation, through its attitudes, its own attitudes, is a peace laboratory. And it can realize this, its mission, if it draws the sap of fraternity, compassion, and solidarity from its roots. The Maltese people receive these values together with the gospel. And thanks to the gospel, they will be able to keep them alive. Thank you.
Ambassador Fraser will be joining us shortly. She's currently leaving United Nations Security Council meeting. Professor Warrington, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I was asked to speak about the purposes that Maltese neutrality serves in our politics, above all. But before I do so, I would like to speak about the constitutional provisions concerning neutrality, because they are extremely interesting. Maltese neutrality is not regulated by legislation, but it's regulated directly by a fairly elaborate clause in the Constitution, sub-article 1(3). This is embedded in Article 1, which speaks about the character and the territory of the state. Article 1 is embedded in turn in Chapter 1 of the Constitution, which speaks about the state and the nation. In contrast to the first 3 chapters of the Constitution, which deal, as I said, chapter 1 with the state and the nation, chapter 2, the principles of public policy, and chapter 3, in a skeletal way, in a very schematic way, with citizenship. In contrast to the provisions in these chapters, which are for the most part dealing with principle, stating principles, Article 1.3, which deals with neutrality, is very detailed. Let's have a look at it. So it begins with a positive statement, namely to say that Malta is a neutral state actively pursuing peace, security, and social progress among all nations by adhering to a policy of non-alignment. This is immediately followed by a negative or a renunciation statement. So the sentence goes on to say, by adhering to a policy of non-alignment and refusing, this is the negative part, to participate in any military alliance. So immediately this orients us to the character of Maltese neutrality, which the remainder of the subarticle spells out in considerable detail. So it's fundamentally a military neutrality with a purpose, with a particular purpose, in other words, to allow this neutral state to actively pursue peace, security, and social progress among all nations. There follow a number of precise exclusions. So what does this refusal to participate in military alliances entail? How is it limited, and what are its boundaries? First of all, it says there ought to be no foreign military bases on the islands. Secondly, that foreign military forces should not use military facilities available on Maltese territory, except at the government's request in 3 circumstances: for the purpose of self-defense of the Republic, secondly, in pursuance of measures decided by the UN Security Council, and thirdly, which is in a way a restatement of the first circumstance, in the event of a threat to the sovereignty, neutrality, and unity of the Republic. There follow some permissions. So, foreign military personnel assisting in civil works or defense are permitted on the islands, and the second permission concerns the use of the shipyards by naval vessels of external powers. There is something somewhat antiquated about this, particularly the reference to the shipyards, because Malta, by the Second World War, was no longer fundamentally a naval base, it was an aerial base. And there is no mention whatsoever of the possibility of using Malta's airport for military purposes. Some comments about this interesting, fairly complex, and in some ways somewhat archaic clause, in others a very advanced clause. It is part of what I call the covenantal provisions of the Constitution, the first 4 chapters, 3 of which I've mentioned, the 4th deals with fundamental rights and freedoms. In other words, here, neutrality is part of a pact between the state and its citizens, and between the state and other states. As I mentioned, it's far and away the most detailed article in the first 3 chapters, and it makes law rather than being content with laying down a principle. As I read it, the balance of these provisions concerning neutrality tilts firmly towards the preservation of Maltese security. Not simply security against external aggression, but also the liberty of the Maltese state and the nation to flourish unconstrained by the strategic interests of great powers, which was one of the defining themes of Maltese history. What then, in light of what I have said, is the meaning and relevance of neutrality in Malta's domestic political landscape? I would say there are 2 points to be made in this regard. The clause on neutrality was inserted as part of a constitutional bargain struck in the early part of 1987 to settle a long-standing constitutional crisis. This is about halfway through the progress of Malta's constitution. The circumstances in which neutrality was entrenched in the constitution were not propitious for making it legitimate. However, as I see it over the last 30 years, there has formed a broad, somewhat uneasy political consensus around Maltese neutrality. At least the 2 major political parties seem to converge on this. However, in particular circumstances, there have been, once again, doubts and differences surfacing over the precise terms of Maltese neutrality. For example, over the question early on of the repair of American naval vessels in the dockyard. Quite dramatically, one of the leading issues in the run-up to Malta's EU membership. Would the common foreign and security policy mean that Malta's neutrality is somehow compromised? Once again, over Malta's stance in the Libyan revolution, and more recently in regard to the war in Ukraine. No question arose over whether Malta would be militarily neutral or not. However, the question of the application of sanctions, there seems to have been a little bit of unease over this. What is the fundamental purpose of neutrality? I'm going to depart from what the Catholic social doctrine suggests. Speaking strictly from the point of view of statehood, neutrality is a policy stance intended fundamentally to protect a country's security, particularly the security of relatively small, powerless states. It offers them the possibility of taking a distinctive stance in world or regional affairs, which, among other things, permits them occasionally to serve as honest brokers or to champion particular causes. I'm not sufficiently well informed about Malta's diplomatic record to say to what extent neutrality formally declared in the Constitution has been used for the purpose for which it was declared, in other words, to promote peace and so on. But even before neutrality was inserted into the Constitution, looking at Malta's diplomatic record over 60-odd years, I would say that there have been instances in which, in multilateral fora, notably the United Nations, Malta has used its influence, its offices as an honest broker, to sponsor some important global initiatives, particularly the law of the sea, intended to protect both human welfare, more broadly, and global assets like the seas. And Malta has also, I think, quite staunchly defended the Palestinian cause in a way which was very, I think, humane and understanding, and quite consistent as well. That's fundamentally what I have to say. So I would not say that Malta's neutrality honors in every respect, Catholic social teaching. There is an element of idealism about it. There's also a great deal of realism. Realism about Malta's circumstances, realism about its history for centuries. I think fundamentally, the intention is to avoid entanglements in military alliances in order for the country to flourish. This renunciation of military alliances also leaves a great deal of latitude to Maltese foreign policy to contribute to global peace and human welfare.
Thank you very much, Professor Warrington. Our next speaker is Mr. Rainier Sudney. In the meantime, we also welcome Ambassador Fraser, who has joined us from New York. Thank you for joining us. Mr. Sudney.
Good evening, everyone. I've been asked to answer 3 questions. How has neutrality worked in practice? Is there a place for it today? Is it desirable today? And I have the luxury of 10 minutes. Let me begin by giving 3 of my assumptions, which I think are important to lay out on the table. 1, political neutrality is not the same as moral neutrality. 2, it is reckless to think that you can join a military alliance to improve your moral life. Now, there are some good reasons for joining a military alliance, but a military alliance would like to be Godzilla, not St. Francis. The first casualties of war, and the military alliance is, of course, a machine geared for war, is truth, justice, liberty, and human fraternity. So let's get that out of the way. Finally, I think it is reckless to base a foreign policy or a constitutional geostrategic commitment to neutrality on the basis of guessing who and what is on the right side of history, assuming history does have a right side. So we have to take our decisions under the veil of ignorance, the fog of war and propaganda, and making the best that we can, assuming worst-case scenarios. Now, to get to the question, how has it worked, we've heard that more or less, if you look at the constitutional provisions on neutrality, you can break it up into 3 parts. You have a part which is extremely detailed concerning military alliances, and it's couched in Cold War language, which makes it very difficult to use without some kind of modification. And that became quickly defunct because this provision was passed in 1987. By 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. By 1991, you could no longer speak of a Cold War or 2 superpowers. And then there are 2 other parts. You have a qualified pacifism, so we are committed to peace, qualified only by UN Security Council resolutions, which we can follow. And then there is neutrality, which, while it is not explicitly stated, in practice it has been the case that our neutrality is qualified by international law. In other words, we have had bipartisan agreement that taking a stand on the Palestinian-Israeli issue, where we deemed it that international law has been broken, would not in fact violate our neutrality. We have taken a similar stand on Ukraine, deeming, in our view, that international law has been broken or violated by Russia, even though Russia protests that it has not. So there are these 2, and we need to keep them apart, I think, in order to understand the dynamic. Because I would argue that one part has worked better than the other, or rather, the commitment, active commitment to peace has worked pretty well. It has a pedigree going before 1987 all the way back to 1964 because of the kinds of initiatives that Professor Warrington has delineated and which continued in initiatives even after 87 concerning bringing climate change to the attention of diplomats in the United Nations, initiatives within the context of the Euro-Mediterranean framework as it was. In this context, neutrality tended to follow in the wake and very much the page boy of the proactive commitment to peace. The reason I put it this way is that neutrality couldn't be tested. Soon after it was constitutionalized, we had a unipolar world. It was not just a unipolar world in the sense that one superpower disappeared. It was a golden age for liberal institution building, in which the proactive commitment to peace by Malta could be pursued almost flamboyantly, and in which neutrality per se was never tested. And this explains why even the shallowest politician in Malta can give a pretty good off-the-cuff speech about Malta's initiatives in favor of peace and bridge building, because it really was part of the environment. For a long time, it became part of the hackneyed political discourse. But it is difficult nowadays to find a single politician who can actually even articulate the purpose of neutrality on neutrality's own terms. And that is partly because there has been a silence for different reasons over it, but it has also been because there haven't been the contexts in which it could be tested. And pre-87, the neutrality we did get was actually Plan B. So Borch Olivier, even while pursuing a commitment to peace and justice internationally, actually wanted NATO membership. Dom Mintoff wanted the neutralization of Malta, didn't get it. So the neutrality that was eventually constitutionalized did not even have a very eloquent thinking of it beforehand, to the extent that some of the champions of neutrality sometimes spoke about it in terms of how to keep our heads down, and sometimes spoke about it, sometimes in the same breath, as how to stick our necks out. It sounds more like a rationalization. Now, we have always pursued our proactive commitment to peace within a geostrategic framework, which changed from the 1970s to the 1980s to the 1990s. So in the 70s, the constitutionalization of neutrality and non-alignment, it was in the context of a clear arms race in the Mediterranean by the two superpowers, in the context where the southern Mediterranean was divided between countries that were more or less allied, at least in terms of military cooperation, with the Soviet Union, and others with the United States. By the time it's constitutionalized, by the early 1990s, actually most of the Arab countries are actually within the orbit of the United States. By the year 2000, even Libya is there, and the only exception is Syria. So that was the context in which why neutrality could not be tested. Sometimes we were debating neutrality and American warships when those warships were coming from an Arab country where they had just conducted exercises. Now, the reason why we're discussing the problem today is that the balance between these two has changed. We are now clearly in a multipolar world. So neutrality is back and is being tested, while the geostrategic vision that we used to have or used to depend on in order to pursue our commitment to peace has disappeared. What used to be the Euro-Mediterranean framework of the European Union died more or less 10 years ago. nothing has taken its place except a policing concept of the Mediterranean. The difference between the European Union and the United States, and before it the British colonial power, was that when the US said Mediterranean, it meant what the Sixth Fleet understands by the Mediterranean, a sea to be patrolled. When the EU spoke of the Mediterranean, what it meant was a geo-economic concept which necessarily had to include non-Mediterranean states like Portugal and Jordan, and on Gaddafi's insistence, Mauritania. All those issues have, for practical purposes, disappeared, and the only way in which the EU nowadays tends to talk about the Mediterranean is from a policing concept controlling migrants. So the geostrategy has gone, although there are plenty of other actors in the Mediterranean with a pretty sharp geostrategic vision of what they want. Turkey, Russia, China, the Gulf states are all active. Do you think the Gulf states want a democratic Libya or even a democratic Tunisia? Come on. They're not Godzilla, but they are sane. If an oil-producing country becomes a democracy, time's up for them. So we think that the Mediterranean may be marginal, but it is an illusion produced by the fact that we are not paying attention and that our conception of the world is being driven by the eastern boundary of Europe. That's not a bad thing in itself, but it is creating a blind spot. Now, we cannot discuss neutrality without first developing the geostrategic concept of the Mediterranean for our day. Then we can see if neutrality can actually help or hinder. To do it the other way around is to put the cart before the horse.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. I was asked to talk about a more international perspective on neutrality, and I wanted to join my colleagues in first talking a little bit more about the definition, because neutrality is a thorny issue, and that's something that I will come back to in my presentation. Obviously, we have to first distinguish between neutrality in a particular conflict and neutrality as a more permanent stance in foreign policy. So if we take the particular case of the Ukraine war, we can see that there are a large number of states, in particular in Africa, but also a country such as India, that have declared themselves neutral, saying that this is not our conflict, and we do not want to in any way take part in the issues around it. Obviously, what we're discussing here today is the more permanent form of neutrality, or what in Sweden is called alliansfrihet I frid syftande till neutralitet I händelse av krig. This is something that none of you will understand, but it's a very often used sentence in Swedish, meaning non-alignment in peace, aiming for neutrality in the event of war. Swedish neutrality dates back to the end of the Napoleonic Wars. So Swedish neutrality was a long-standing cornerstone of Swedish foreign policy. There was a strong popular attachment to the concept of neutrality, and it was echoed in particular in the Social Democratic Party, which obviously has been in power for a number of years in the Swedish context. And this was true up until the early days of the Ukraine war. Before Sweden joined the EU, it had chosen what it called an active neutrality, which it didn't preclude it from being vociferous or loud, as some others would probably call it. One of the most famous instances date back to the late 1972, when the Swedish Prime Minister at the time, Olof Palme, held a radio speech in which he condemned the US bombings of Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam. He called it a form of torture. He said that it was tormenting a nation to humiliate it, and he went on to compare it to a number of atrocities. Guernica, Oradour, Babi Yar, Katyn, Lidice, Sharpeville, Treblinka, and he ended by saying, now another name is added to the list, Hanoi, Christmas 1972. This led to a freezing of relations between Sweden and the US for almost 2 years. And this was a particular reading of neutrality. Switzerland, which was the other country that I was asked to talk about today, had a very different conception, which could maybe be called more rigorous or restrictive understanding of neutrality. Switzerland has been permanently neutral since the Congress of Vienna in 1815, but its policy of neutrality dates back even further than that. For a long time, the way that the Swiss perceived neutrality was to say that it precluded even membership in the United Nations. So the Swiss state, although it hosted one of the main headquarters at the global level of the UN, was not a member until 2002. And that followed a referendum in which both the cantons, the majority of the cantons, and the population had to vote yes. And I lived in Switzerland at the time, and it was not clear until the last moment that there was actually going to be a yes. But there was, and Switzerland joined. Switzerland has remained outside of the EU, unlike Finland and Sweden, but neutrality was one of several considerations in this decision. So to summarize, Switzerland, like Sweden, has a very strong, long-standing, historically anchored tradition of neutrality, even though they have been conceptualized in very different ways. Finland, the third country that I'm going to mention briefly, is again a very different scenario, because neutrality was not a choice, but it was imposed on them after the Second World War. Finlandization is a concept that many of you will be familiar with, which meant that the Soviet Union had a say both over the domestic policies of Finland and over its foreign policy. So Finland's neutrality dated back to 1948, when it had to sign a peace agreement, a treaty of friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance with the Soviet Union. And that instituted Finnish neutrality. It was only after Stalin's death and the beginning of the détente at the international level that Finland could pursue a more active neutrality policy. But it did take care not to irritate the great powers. One of Finland's ambassadors to the UN once said that Finland tried to handle its relationship between East and West equally well, while Sweden tried to handle them equally badly. It refrained from criticizing the US, and in particular the USSR. So when the USSR went into Afghanistan in late 1979, there was in early 1980 a vote in the General Assembly asking for a retreat of Soviet troops. In this case, more than 100 out of 148 countries voted yes to demand this, but Finland stayed on the sidelines by abstaining from voting. It only became a member of the Council of Europe in 1989. So Malta became a member immediately on independence in a year after, in 1965, and Switzerland had joined in 1963. Even though at the end of the Cold War, the Finns were free to stop this neutrality policy, they had kind of gotten used to it and come to live with it and think of it as the best solution in a difficult neighborhood and the best solution in balancing Russia. So it chose not to follow Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania and abandon neutrality. Underlying all these three countries' is a strong orientation towards the values of the West: democracy, market economy, and the rule of law. So even though the rhetoric of neutrality has been very strong, in some instances, particular policies and unofficial policies have been sometimes less neutral, and that's something we could discuss later if there is time. So given the strong variations between Finland and Sweden and Switzerland, and the way that they have used neutrality and the way that neutrality was instituted, we could maybe have expected that the Ukraine war would be conditioned on this past, but that has not been the case. There's one single determinant for how these three neutral countries have acted in the face of the Ukraine war, and that's geography. So Sweden and Finland submitted their official requests to join NATO on the 18th of May 2022 because of their geographical position and the threat that they feel. Switzerland has not even contemplated NATO membership for the simple reason that they do not feel that threat. Finnish President Sauli Niinistö, who is well known for his frankness, said just before making the NATO request official, and he addressed Vladimir Putin directly, he said, "You caused this, look yourself in the mirror." So that was his way of saying, this is why we're doing this. Finland was obviously a part of Imperial Russia under the Tsars until 1918. So with Russian talk of recreating borders going back to Tsarist times, Finland felt directly threatened. And when Finland took the step of joining, Sweden in a way did not have that much choice but to follow suit because of the linkages of the defense policies of the two countries and the way that they were integrated in defense terms. So although Sweden has never been part of the Russian Empire and was hence not under a direct threat, it still took that policy line. Though Switzerland did not contemplate changing its neutral status, it did take some unprecedented moves after the Ukraine war. So it instituted sanctions against Russian oligarchs, which was the first time that it adopted sanctions which weren't UN sanctioned. So they were not decided by the UN Security Council, but by the EU. However, they have not implemented these sanctions with enormous zeal. They have seized around 7 billion worth of assets, but they are thought to be more than 200 billion worth of assets in Swiss banks. Moreover, they have refused Spanish, German, and Danish requests for the re-export of armaments. So basically, the Swiss have exported weapons. They're a large weapons exporter, and when another country wants to re-export, they have to ask the original exporter, so Switzerland, for permission. And they have not granted permission for re-exports to Ukraine of weapons and ammunition. Moreover, last month, it decided to destroy surface-to-air defense systems rather than sending them to Kiev. So they have some obsolete weapons, surface-to-air missiles, and also coming for destruction in the coming months are tanks, and they're going to destroy them rather than send them to Ukraine. So what we're seeing are very different foreign policy stances and very different understandings of neutrality.
Thank you very much, Professor Kaki. Now hand over the floor to Ambassador Vanessa Fraser from New York. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I apologize for logging in late, but the Security Council ends at 1 o'clock here, so it was just the time to get to my laptop and log on. Thank you for inviting me to join this panel discussion to mark the 60th anniversary of the Papal Encyclical. In my intervention, I will focus on Malta's current role on the United Nations Security Council. As I'm sure everyone is aware, Malta's tenure on the Council started earlier this year on 1st January after being elected by the General Assembly in June 2022. The two-year term provides Malta with an opportunity to contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security in a meaningful manner. It gives Malta a chance to work towards safeguarding the values and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter, the foundational treaty of the United Nations as agreed in San Francisco in 1945. Malta's neutrality does not neutralize us, nor does it mean that we are indifferent to what happens in the world. It has not stopped us from criticizing and condemning actions that we consider to be inconsistent or in violation of the UN Charter and the principles enshrined therein. This is all the more relevant given the challenging times characterized by geopolitical tensions during which Malta is serving on the Council. Malta is a bridge builder committed to neutrality, disarmament, peace, and consensus through dialogue with all. Unfortunately, when neutrality is discussed, many times we focus on what we cannot do or what we perceive we cannot do. However, our neutrality ought to be perceived as a strength for Malta's foreign policy. It safeguards our effectiveness and credibility, allowing us to serve as a moral compass. It enables us to identify areas of common interest, forge consensus, and advance peace and security with all members of the Security Council, as well as the wider UN membership. Malta's moral compass on the Security Council is very clear. It is peace, security, and stability, dialogue, de-escalation, reason, and the respect of international law. This is what we advocate in the international community. In shaping its neutrality, Malta shares the international responsibilities of the community of nations and contributes actively to the needs of international solidarity in defense against aggression and in serving peace. Concerning peace, when neutrality was enshrined in our constitution, peace was still only considered at the time the absence of war. However, today, peace transcends this. When we talk about peace, we talk about democracy, rule of law, human rights, poverty eradication, education, gender equality, peace building, transitional justice, and climate action, amongst others. It is about rebuilding societies and creating the conditions for a peace which is sustainable. I will refer to a few examples in recent years and also as regards to the Security Council. In 2011, during the Libya crisis, which was mentioned by earlier speakers, Malta was thrown in the spotlight when 2 Libyan Air Force Mirage jet fighters unexpectedly landed in Malta. This was followed by numerous requests to assist in the evacuation of foreign nationals, wounded soldiers, and civilians. Malta became a humanitarian hub, and to this day, many are still grateful for Malta's assistance and the role we played in alleviating the crisis. Russia's aggression against Ukraine is another example. Only yesterday, in an open debate organized by the Russian presidency of the Security Council on strengthening multilateralism, Malta once again expressed its deep concern that Russia blatantly disregarded the primary function of the Security Council when it launched its aggression against Ukraine. This illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified war generated one of the worst refugee crises since the Second World War. A global grain shortage, hundreds of thousands killed or injured, forced deportations of children, worldwide anxiety for a nuclear disaster, and negatively impacted the credibility of this very council. On this occasion, Malta once again urged Russia to stop this war, withdraw its military forces from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, and turn to dialogue and diplomacy as the tools which can bring stability to the region. Disarmament and non-proliferation is another file on which Malta holds a strong and consistent position and pushes for a world free of nuclear weapons. Malta signed a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, the so-called TPNW, in August 2020 and ratified it in September 2020. Thereby, Malta was one of the first 50 states to ratify this treaty, effectively contributing to its entry into force in January 2021. We hope that the TPNW can inject much-needed momentum in the global disarmament discourse, which unfortunately have stalled in a number of fronts. The failure by a number of UN fora to move forward on disarmament files, combined with the erosion of a number of Cold War-era treaties and guarantees, particularly affecting Europe, has created a new sense of urgency to work on the multilateral front to ensure that existing treaties are strengthened and new ground is broken. The relevance of the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention in the contemporary world are just a few examples of how we need to work together to ensure that the global disarmament architecture works. We cannot speak about non-proliferation without mentioning the DPRK, North Korea. Earlier this month, DPRK launched yet another intercontinental ballistic missile, and in doing so, once again violated a number of Security Council resolutions. Since the start of 2022, 11 intercontinental ballistic missiles have been launched. Malta was amongst those council members calling for urgent meetings to discuss these worrying developments. As a last example, but not less important, are humanitarian efforts and the protection of civilians. The protection of civilians over the risks of further conflict and humanitarian suffering is placed at the center of our work. For example, with Malta's support and participation in peace support missions, and its support and active engagement in the field of children and armed conflict. This also implies a strong advocacy for parties involved in armed conflict to observe international humanitarian law in full. It also includes supporting countries, in particular small island and small island developing states, and ensuring the organizations that explicitly exist to respond to crises are enabled to carry out their mandates. In conclusion, given the current geopolitical context and its own foreign policy environment, it is in Malta's interest to enhance its engagement on the international stage, deepen its participation in security structures and programs in support of peace and security, and orient its foreign, security and defense policy more consistently and coherently towards international cooperation whilst respecting its neutrality. Malta's enhanced international engagement is to be especially conducted within the structures and cooperative frameworks of which it is a member. It is to be achieved through concrete initiatives that would energize a proactive and dynamic interpretation of Malta's neutrality, demonstrating that it is not an opportunistic middle ground comfort zone. At a time of increased polarization, confrontation, and transactional relations, Malta is actively seeking political spaces for dialogue and building trust towards consensual solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you to all the speakers for offering us your insightful views and for sticking to the 10 minutes. I know it was not easy. First of all, I would like to once again thank all our speakers and all those who took the time to come and participate in this very important discussion, which obviously doesn't finish here. And as I said, we don't have all the answers and we don't pretend to have all the answers, but we think that it's important that the discussion continues in some way or another, either by saying that no, we have to remain neutral at all costs, but what does that mean? As we said, even the definition of neutrality itself and what it means in this changing geopolitical scenario is not so obvious. So that's why it's important that this topic is discussed in all important fora, not only within the church, obviously. And to conclude this conference, I invite Bishop Galia Kormi to address us.
Thank you very much. I thank the speakers, even Your Excellency who has joined us online, and all those who have participated here. I would like to conclude with a prayer, because we have already discussed enough. And this is the prayer of Pope Francis in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, one of the two prayers. Lord, Father of our human family, you created all human beings equal in dignity. Put forth in our hearts a fraternal spirit and inspire in us a dream of renewed encounter, dialogue, justice, and peace. Move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world, a world without hunger, poverty, violence, and war. May our hearts be open to all the peoples and nations of the earth. May we recognize the goodness and beauty that you have sown in each of us, and thus forge bonds of unity, common projects, and shared dreams. Amen. Thank you very much. Bye.